Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Cycling Journal, a podcast that brings you stories of transformation. Happy to have you join me on the Cycling Journal podcast. My name is Divya Tate, and I'm looking forward to sharing stories with all of you of cycling, one of my favorite subjects to talk about, which is not just cycling itself, but how cycling has changed us, how cycling has changed so many of the people that I've had the pleasure of meeting in the cycling world in the last 10 or more years. I'm going to go back to the roots, so to speak, about where I started cycling from, just to give you a background about what it was that allowed me to be in this place today and how I think that cycling might have changed my life. So I know a lot of you have heard that I started cycling as an adult in 1992, but my memory about cycling goes back to my childhood. And I know that this is something that a lot of people experience when they start cycling. Some of us have recollections from our childhood about uh, cycling or what we felt like when we rode a cycle. And sometimes those memories stay with us into adulthood and sometimes they don't. For me, my earliest memory, and it's a very, very clear memory that I have of the first day that I actually learned how to ride a bike. I must have been about 8 or 9 years old. I know that leading up to that point, my dad and maybe there were other friends or others around who were struggling to get me to be able to cycle on my own. And maybe because we had left it so late, and I was around 8 years old at the time and scared of falling, somehow that there was some struggle. I was not able to just let go. And I remember that my dad I would, want for him to keep holding my cycle as we pushed through along the lanes. And uh, what happened is that one day while everybody was busy, I remember that day so clearly. There was some kind of a get together going on. My father was in the Air Force, so we lived in an Air Force station, and I was really lucky that my childhood was like that I had free access to open roads. It was safe for me as a child to be able to wander around. So there was some kind of a get together going on in my house, and so adults were busy basically, and kids were just doing their own thing. People were playing, and at some point, I just sort of, decided that I was just going to take the cycle out onto the road. And I took it out, and that was my first memory of being able to cycle on my own. And the amazing thing is that I'm 54 now. That was 40 more, more than 4 decades back. But that memory stays really clear in my head even today. I remember that day. I remember so many things that happened around it. And I think that's a part of what happens to us when we start cycling, that somehow our senses, our perception of things around us changes dramatically, whether we recognize it or not. And I think that was what happened because that memory really stayed with me. Unfortunately, within that year itself, my father left the Air Force and we moved to Bombay. And when we moved to Bombay City, my cycle was sold. And Bombay City being the kind of place it was a bit of a rude shock for me as a child, going from a place where I was able to wander around freely and safely and have the access to the outdoors, to be in a city like Bombay where I lost all that. I think I did not quite articulate or understand how deeply I felt that loss until much later. So it was when I left Bombay City and I moved to Pune in 1992. Within the first few weeks of having moved here, I bought myself a bicycle. And I assure you, in 1992, the bicycles that we owned were like very, very basic, low-khand bicycle. It was a Hercules Top Gear. And it was one of the country's like first geared bicycles, which means it had 6 gears, and it had that shifter. I'm forgetting what the name of the shifter is. Maybe it'll come back to me. But it was not even like the push shifter. It was like really basic. And sometimes you almost had to, stop doing everything just to be able to change gears on the bicycle. But on that basic bike, um, I again, it's interesting how the moment I started cycling, I those memories are very clear and very distinct. The first day that I took that bicycle out for a ride on what used to be a country lane back then, and within a few kilometers, like 2 3 kilometers, I'm talking, I was exhausted, and I just came back, and the first ride was just 5 6 kilometers, but I remember it clearly, and I remember how my legs felt, etc. And then within a few weeks, I was pushing that barrier from 5 or 6 kilometers to 10 12 kilometers and exploring the countryside. And that's how in 1992, as an adult, I must have been in my 20s then, I started bicycling. And since that time, cycling has very much been a part of my life. So I started cycling then, and maybe for the next uh, 8 or 10 years, I think I changed bicycles a little bit, but I started commuting on this bicycle, and I started exploring the countryside around Pune city on this bicycle, and that was the main thing. I think being able to get outdoors under my own steam was what was really transformational for me. What really grabbed my interest in bicycling was it that it allowed me this freedom. And in fact, it was in 95 and 97, I had my children. So there was a few breaks in this cycling while I was pregnant, etc. But I still did a lot of outdoor activity, but I wasn't cycling so much during that time. And then by the end of that decade, in 99, was when I decided to get divorced. And with two little children, just preparing myself for this complete change that was going to happen in my life of being singularly responsible for them, singularly responsible for everything. It was a hard decision, but I was cycling again then. And what that did for me was that, and I know I'm articulating this later, but I know that cycling gave me an enormous amount of willpower and strength in believing that I could do anything, that whatever challenges were going to come in my personal life were challenges that I was going to be able to face and deal with. And a large part of it was because I was cycling. So, a couple of the things that the cycling did for me was at that point to release me from being very release me from having an attachment to the material world, to wealth. I had till that point been from a pretty, comfortable background economically. And now, with the divorce coming up, I was facing the possibility that I'm not going to be able to be as, have as much um, uh, you know, have as much money to spend on myself, and of course, the responsibility of the children was going to be overbearing over um, any of these other activities. So, this is what happened with the bicycling was that I immediately was able to detach from the comfort of material life. I was able to face the fact that the discomfort of being sweaty, of being dirty on the bicycle, of having to move to commute. I was using it to commute back then. So commuting from one place to the other could be achieved by my own physical strength, by energy that I was generating. I didn't need anything else. I didn't need a vehicle, and I didn't need um, fuel or anything else to enable me to transport myself. And that gave me a sense of, okay, I can do this, and I can probably do a lot more things then as well. And and like I said, coming back to the whole thing about discomfort, you know, all of us who cycle, we know that we push certain barriers of comfort and discomfort. I mean, if you imagine that the most comfortable place to be or the most comfortable way to be is, say, sitting in your living room, then bicycling outdoors under different kinds of weather, different kinds of climate, different kind of condition, traffic, and of course the physical energy that you are going to have to put into it, all of that adds to becoming more uncomfortable. And so when you start enjoying that discomfort, there's some little breakthrough that happens in the way in which you look at discomfort itself. It's not so bad actually, and you look at the rewards of that discomfort. That so being able to bicycle allowed me to explore the countryside, and I felt like okay, I was able to uh, have adventure. I was able to have fun and joy, and enjoy the environment around me without any material attachment. And that played a huge role in changing who I was, changing my perception about things. For sure, that year, 1999, 2000, were big transformations for me. So I became a single parent with two children. I moved out, started setting up a completely different kind of a life for myself. Gave up my previous career, which was that of an architect, to exploring other things, art and craft, and oh, I explored a lot of things. We'll come back to that at some other point. But so coming back to what the cycling at that point, my journey with the cycling was that this happened, and soon after I separated, we I got interested in environmental issues, and of course that was also related to bicycling. Bicycling to commute for sure is an act of consuming less, of using something which requires no power from requires no source of energy from the outside. It's coming all from within. So I did get interested in environmental issues that were going on back. I mean, those issues are all still here. I got involved and interested in them then. And while attending a series of discussions, I came across a group which was at that point um, doing critical mass cycling rallies. So, critical mass was a cycling movement that started in the US, I think in California, way back. And there was somebody from there who was visiting India at that time, and we started to do critical mass rallies in the city. And I've attended some of those rallies with my kids. Met for the first time other people who were into cycling, some who have remained interested in cycling since then, very few. Most of the others stopped. But for me, so that was back in 2001, in which I was doing this, and it was it was a sense of joy and adventure, frankly, for me, even to be doing this and meeting people through this. And um, soon after that, I started to push my limit a little bit with the cycling. I started to do slightly longer distances, and I started to explore the countryside on my bicycle, pushing a little bit more because every time I went out, it would be like, oh, I wish I could go a little further. And so that's what I would do the next time. Most of this cycling was done uh, solo. I didn't really have any company back then. I didn't know anybody else who cycled. On a rare occasion, I would find somebody, a companion who would be willing to join me or who was already doing cycling himself. I don't think I knew any women who were cycling back then at all. And I did have very strong women friends with whom I did trekking, which we would go off again. It was another adventure living in the middle of the Sayadris. So it was a lot of it was about this terrain actually, for sure. The Sayadris just called out to me to either explore them on foot, by trekking, or bicycling. And I enjoyed bicycling. And most of the cycling I did was um, not exactly off road, but like bad country road sort of things on an MTB. By this time, I think in the mid 2000s, I probably graduated to a slightly um, um, slightly better bike than what I had previously, which was it was again Hercules. It was something called the Twin Bow. It was a dark purple colored frame. It was a long frame. It was excellent for touring, but it was really heavy. I think it must have weighed about 20 kgs or something. And another Lokhand bike, solid Lokhand bike with a slightly more upgraded version of the gears. I think by this time I had front and rear gears. It was also still, I remember the name of the kind of shifters we had. Those were called grip shifts. So, grip shifts is something, if I don't know if any of you have come across grip shift, but these were like back in the day, the grip shift literally needed like some real strength to be able to shift things, to actually shift your gears from this wrist action on your handlebar for it to translate down to your this locant shifter actually shifting your gear. But I mean, the thing is that I can say all this now. Back then, I didn't know anything else, and I didn't have any problems with the equipment that I had. It was the equipment that I had didn't play any role at all in um, I mean, the equipment served me and it didn't hinder me in any way. It didn't stop me from doing anything. And in fact, it served me in allowing me to do all this stuff. So, this was in the mid 2000s that I was now exploring the countryside. Like I said, I was doing long distance. I started to do touring also, in which this bicycle allowed me to put a nice heavy haversack on the rear and carry me and my weight and everything else that I wanted to and go out exploring. I did one tour in the Sayadris itself, and then my second one was along the coastline of Maharashtra with a friend, and we actually carried a tent. I did a part of that on my own solo, and a part of it with another friend, and we carried our tents on these bikes. And frankly, the equipment didn't play a role in my head, and I rarely had any problems. I rarely had any punctures also. To confess something to those of you who now would find it horrifying that I used to tour that way, was that I didn't actually even know how to repair a puncture during that time. It was well afterwards, after I got my first trek and started doing events, etc., that I learned how to fix my own puncture. Till then, we would just go to the person, the next village, and find somebody who fixed things for you. I never carried a toolkit with me also. I kind of just knew that I'd be able to get my bike fixed wherever I was. And yeah, it was a little bit ram bharose, I guess. So then that was in the mid 2000s. Around 2008, there's an interesting thing that I would like to at this point bring up, which is that a lot of things started to change in that time. That's the late 2000s, 2007, 8 onwards. We started to have imported bicycles being sold in India. Again, none of that was the kind of equipment that you see today. Those were very basic imported bicycles with very basic mountain bike frames, and they were low end mountain bikes also. I had a lot of issues when I actually went from low-khand bicycle, which anybody could repair, Tok Peat KB. When I went to the first of the aluminum mountain bikes, I actually faced more problems with them because now there was a little fragility to the equipment, and they were not very high tech, they were not very good quality. So now equipment started to play a little bit of a role in this, but it also gave me a different ability to do more things. We'll come to that as I, talk about how things progressed at a much faster rate after this. So when the bicycles first started to be introduced in India, we started to have a couple of events being conducted. I think Bangalore was one of the few cities which started this movement of having races and other things back then. Then there was MTB Himachal, which started up, and these bicycles would now start to enable us to take part in these things. Um, I continued. I had an MTB back then, a Trek, which I still have, and I love that bicycle. Um, it's a Trek, and I've used it extensively to do stuff. I even rode my first BRM on that. So as these events started up, we started to have this good equipment, and there was another critical factor which happened across on the other side of this planet. The US faced the stock market crash in 2008, by which time a lot of Indians, especially from the tech domain, had been living and working in the US and had got exposed to the idea of bicycling being a cool thing, had got exposed to the whole activity and the equipment, and the crash sent a lot of them back home. And this created a change that was very, very visible to me because by that time, by 2008, I had been cycling for 15 or 16 years. And like I said, I didn't have any company. Most of the time, I was cycling solo. And the reason for this was that we Indians looked down upon cycling. See, people cycle in this country. They cycle on the roadster. It's huge. The volume of people who use the roadster to commute is enormous. What was different about me was that I come from a different socio-economic background, middle class, urban middle class, and this segment of society back then looked down upon cycling as something that represented the lower socio-economic. So in 2008, when the middle class started to bicycle and this activity grew enormously, the factors that were at play here was one was that now the equipment had started to become something more expensive, obviously. There were imported bicycles, there was better quality equipment, there was these events to take part, and then a large group of people returned from the US in 2008, urban Indians who had been cycling back there, who were now happy to continue doing this activity here. It was no longer uncool, it was no longer something that only the poor did. And this led to an enormous growth of bicycling of the urban Indians, which we see today. So in 2009, we started to have races sporadically in a couple of parts of the country. And in 2009, towards the end of 2009, was when the first BRM of India was announced. The BRM, for those of my listeners who don't know, is Brevet de Randonneur Mondiaux, which is what the Audax India conducts across the country now. And the first BRM that was announced was a 200-kilometer BRM to be held in Bombay. And when I heard about it, I had never actually cycled 200 till then. So I had been cycling for about like 17 years. I had been doing what I called back then long distance touring. But long distance for me meant maybe 70 to 100 kilometers a day of, chilled out, riding, exploring, eating, taking a swim on the beach, trying to find myself a nice place to stay at the end of the day. And so for me, 70 to 100 kilometers covered in a day was long distance. And then this event is announced, which is 200 kilometers to be covered in about 13 and a half hours. And I'm like, I don't know, I've never done that before. And I looked at this event announcement, and oh, here's another important thing that I missed, and what really started to also create an environment in which these things could flourish. And that was the internet. The fact that we were now starting to get connected to people through the internet, through forums, through Facebook also had just about started to get popular back then. There were some other ones. But there was this one forum in India. I can't remember the name. Cyclist.in, I think. It was on I'm sorry, I can't remember what platform it was on, but a lot of it was a discussion forum on which people could create events, people could announce what they were doing, and that was the forum through which a lot of us connected to each other across the country. That was the forum through which I first met other cyclists like myself who were doing this kind of thing. And the BRM was announced on that forum. And I was just observing the forum for a while. I was just observing the discussion, and there was some kind of slightly macho kind of a statement made on the event name, which was like, this is the event that's going to separate the men from the boys. And I'm sitting there looking at that and thinking, oh, well, is it only for men and boys, or, like, so for me that was like a I was being challenged. किसी ने मुझे ललकारा, तो I signed up for it. This was part of the reason why I signed up for that BRM back then. The other reason that I signed up, as I recall, was that I had dislocated my shoulder sometime before that, and the dislocated shoulder had set me back physically. I was not feeling so active. It used to hurt. I was just trying to get back into things, and I thought that doing the brevet would just help me to have a focus on resurrecting my health, so to speak. So I signed up for the brevet without having done more than 100 kilometers before that, and then I thought, okay, I need to see if I can do at least 130 or 150 before I do this. All this is on mountain bike again. And that's what we started to do then. We found there was a small group of us who found each other again through the same forum. And we started to cycle out on weekends. We did what became later like a basic format of bicycling, which was short rides in the week and long rides on the weekend, in which you push your limit and try to figure out whether you can extend the distance that you had done. Very basic. There was no power meters or coaches or anything for this. So I just sort of trained myself to be able to go and face the distance of 200 with confidence. And that brevet it changed a lot of stuff. So first of all that was the first time ever that I did 200 kilometers. I finished it. I think I don't recall meeting another woman there, but I believe there was another woman who also finished it. And there was about 50, 60 of us doing this brevet, and it was quite interesting for me to see this. This was my first real event that I did almost 18 years after starting to cycle. And so in some ways it changed my perspective tremendously. It changed my perspective about myself and my own abilities as well, because in the process of doing that 200, I had crossed or broken down some barriers in my own head of thinking that I couldn't cycle more than 100 or 130 kilometers a day. I'd broken down that barrier. I know that for so many of you right now, this is 2022, more than 10 years later, y'all are cycling crazy distances. But back then, this was the process that happened in my head. And having broken that barrier of 200 kilometers, I sort of reluctantly looked at the possibility of maybe doing 300. It was still like, 300 just seems so much more. You would have stay up till 2 in the night or something. And the first 300 that I signed up for, actually, I fell just before that. So I DNF'd during the 300, and I was kind of ready to say, okay, I'm done with this. But what happened was I got to hear about PBP. And at the time that I first heard about PBP, it was like 1200 kilometers. You're kidding. No one in India talked about distances like this. Nobody did distances like this. So 1200 kilometers was huge. We had just done the first 200 and 300 kilometers, and this is still, we're talking about 4 times the distance. But it seemed interesting. And the more we talked about it and the more we heard about it, the more it seemed to grab my imagination to see, well, I mean, let's just see what lies beyond this 300. And of course, we then found out that what lay beyond the 300 was 400 and 600 and 1,000 kilometers. And oh, I got interested then in, or rather, I got involved in organizing brevets in Pune, and I organized India's first 400-kilometer BRM in 2010. Soon after which, I organized India's first 600 BRM. I organized them because I wanted to ride them, and that was the reason why I got involved in organizing, was simply because, well, there wasn't an event to do, and I had to create the event so that we could ride them. And but before the 600, I actually had a really bad crash and I broke my kneecap. So in that first year, I was not able to complete the SR series. I had to take a break, heal myself. That's another whole long story. And I came back in 2010-11, which was the PBP year. I came back and finished the SR series, by which time I moved on from my mountain bike to a road bike. Actually, it's not really a road bike, but it's a cyclocross which I've modified, and I've been using it on the road ever since. I still do have that bicycle also. And that was one of the changes that were needed to be able to do these long distances in comfort and a little faster than I was on the mountain bike. And 2011, we worked our way to PBP. In 2011, I completed my SR. I became the first woman from India to complete the SR and sign up for Paris Brest Paris, which took place in August of 2011. And that was the first time that there was a contingent from India at this event. As most of you know, PBP is a historic event which is more than a century old. And that was another leap in my whole thinking about cycling, in a big leap in my own abilities or what I could do. The reason why I sort of kind of bring this up is I'm just trying to. It's very easy to see what the environment is like now on the ground in India, how large Audax India is, and how many of these events are supporting these kind of activities now. But in 2011, we had altogether 8 brevets, perhaps, including a 1,000-kilometer brevet, which was conducted in Bangalore, which was the first one. This was all in the lead up to PBP. We didn't have, I mean, today we have like an enormous number of 80 or 90 clubs all across India now. And back then it was literally, there was Pune Randonneurs and there was a club in Bangalore which used to conduct brevets back then. And that's about it. So between the two of us, we did one SR series each, and it was, either you manage in those 8 events to do it, your SR. And that's how we did qualify for PBP. And about, I think we were 15 of us at PBP 2011. And exposed to this event, which has been taking place in France for more than a century, and exposed to the kind of culture that France enjoys in terms of cycling. There's so much. I mean, there's the Tour de France. And I think PPP predates Tour de France. But when we did when we did PPP, the kind of warm welcome that we got, we were at this event where we were being celebrated. We met randonneurs from across the globe, super randonneurs rather, because everybody had done an SR series to qualify to do PPP, and very often we didn't share the same language. So the only bond that we had with each other was the fact that we were into Audax riding and that we had done an SR series in just the last 1 year. And a great joy for cycling. And then we are out there doing PVP, and we can see families who live along that route, that from between Paris and Brest and back, have been there for generations, supporting the participants of PVP, of staying up night after night, offering coffee, offering snacks and cake, and offering a place to come into their house and use the toilet or take a small nap. And it was eye opening. It was like a revelation. India has a fantastic history of other kinds of historic events. Our yatras, and we have religious, sacred routes, or that people follow, pilgrimages that take place in this country. And this was a kind of pilgrimage, but a cycling pilgrimage taking place in France. And it was an exciting thing to be a part of. It was exciting to see this. And I think everything that I was experiencing in that short period of time after having cycled for so many years, there were so many things that I was discovering and getting engaged in, which was giving me such a positive feedback. Um, just connecting with so many people, this suddenly being connected to a worldwide community that already existed, that I really wanted to share this back in India, really wanted people to take joy in doing this. And that was the reason that after coming back, I took over. I became the national representative of this um, of randonneering to the club in France, Audax Club Parisien. I was the national representative from 2011 till about 2021, about 10 years that I ran this. And I came back and I didn't really push for this to happen. I have to say that things had been changing so much in India that just the fact that we were doing this drew other people into doing it. We didn't actively have to go out and call people in to do this activity. People heard about each other, people saw some social media posts somewhere. So there were a few things that played a role in this. The fact that social media existed allowed people to learn about this thing faster. And we soon grew from 3 clubs in 2011 to about 15 clubs. That's 5 times the number in 2014. And by which time I'm like, there's PPP coming around again. It's, 4 years have passed and there's the next PPP coming up, and now we're a much larger community here. And this is how it just kept growing. I founded Audax India Randonneers. And as most of you who have been a part of the Audax India community over here know how much it's grown, how much volume of mileage people are doing, how people have connected to each other across the country. Simultaneously, in 2011, I got exposed to the Race Across America as a crew member. I went there to crew for somebody, and if PVP and 1200 kilometers was staggering, Race Across America was 5,000 kilometers from one coast of the US to the other coast, end to end across a continent, across a really big continent. And that was another mind blowing experience to see the level to which human beings are wanting to push their own limits, to explore how far they can endure the discomfort of cycling. And when I saw Race Across America, I was, so impressed that this was another format that I wanted to introduce in India, because we had nothing back then. And in 2014, I started to conduct the races, which are RAM qualifiers. The first one being the Deccan Cliffhanger. The first edition was in 2014. Now we've done 8 editions of those, and under the banner of another race company which I founded called Inspire India, I started to do these races. We've done the Ultra Spice race, which is 1750 kilometers, and then the world's highest RAM qualifier, which is the Great Himalayan Ultra, which takes place in Leh, Ladakh. So we formed, another sort of a subculture within the Audax, within long distance. Now this was ultra racing. And I think that entire decade of mine from 2010 till 2020 was all about, and of course, my cycling did suffer in that. I kept racing till about 2015 was when I did, there was a race called Desert 500, and I attempted the 500 kilometer over there. I finished it a little outside of their time limit, but I was one of the few people who finished that race in time. And I think I came back from PPP and did one more SR. But on the personal front, for sure, my own personal cycling suffered while I did this. But it was an exciting decade for those 10 years of building up this thing from scratch to seeing it as an established ecosystem in 2020. So by the end of 2019, after I came back from PBP to 2019, I started to have this feeling that my work was done in creating what I wanted to, in ensuring that there was a healthy ecosystem in India. And it's after that I think some of you know that I've sort of actively retired from event organization. I'm still there to support, and in these 10 years, I've met so many people. I've heard so many wonderful stories, and that's the reason for doing this podcast, is to be able to share these stories, to document these journeys. And the stories are so diverse. So many people who couldn't imagine, you know, being where they were or doing what they were doing before they started cycling, before they took up randonneering or long distance or ultra racing, having now journeyed into a completely different life. So, this is what this podcast is going to try and bring out. And I hope to have you engaged in more of these stories as we continue with the Cycling Journal podcast. Join us for the next episode, in which I talk more about cycling in general, all the different kinds of cycling that one can engage in, from commuting to pro racing to mountain biking to ultra cycling, which is more of my domain, so to speak. I will also be talking on what constitutes an ecosystem which fosters cycling, which allows a healthy ecosystem, which allows more people to come in and for performance to generally advance or improve within the community. Community is another topic that we'll talk about what do we speak about when we speak about community. And we will also be talking in a little bit detail about all the different formats of ultra racing and ultra cycling that we have today. Goodbye and see you soon.